Coming up next is our final discussion before the closing remarks. I'm going to go ahead and introduce Marilyn Averill. She's from UC Boulder School of Law. She's a senior fellow at the Getches-Wilkinson Center for Natural Resources, Energy, and the Environment. So she is probably in the correct place. And I'll let her introduce her fellow panelists. The panel is going to be called Moving One Step In, Oil and Gas Best Practices. So take it away. Thank you very much.
Well, first of all, you'll notice that I'm not Wiley Rhodes. Wiley was not able to be here, and he sends his regrets. Really wish that he could have been here. He was the one who, with the Getches-Wilkinson Center, co-sponsored the oil and gas charrette, and all four of us were there at that charrette. So we're going to be talking about some of the things that we discussed there, as well as some other things on oil and gas. And I should say that I am not an oil and gas person. I'm an environmental attorney, but my interests are mainly in climate change and the politics of science and ethical implications of climate issues. But I was fascinated by the charrette process, and I'm going to be really interested to hear what my three colleagues here have to say. So let me introduce them first, then I'll make a few introductory remarks, and then turn it over to them. First of all, we have Fred Lamond, who is now the CEO of Lamond Consortium, and spent about 32 years in the oil and gas industry, partly with BP, and had the privilege of running some of the response actions to Deepwater Horizon following the disaster in the Gulf. To his left, you've already met Travis, who's with Anadarko, which is one of the largest oil and gas exploration and production companies in the world. Is that right?
We're pretty big.
You're pretty big?
We're the largest in Colorado, yeah.
And you've already heard a lot about what Travis knows about the oil and gas industry and about clean tax cuts. And finally, we have Zane Rhodes, who happens to be Wiley's brother, but also on his own is CEO of Flashpoint Control, and is an engineer and is particularly interested in the technical and the technology issues relating to the kinds of things that Sally was asking about with certification and measurement issues, as well as developing the kinds of technologies that will help to make the oil and gas industry a little bit cleaner. So let me start with the name of the session, which is Moving One Step In, and explain why it's called One Step In. And that's because Wiley Rhodes started the One Step In Foundation. Wiley is a real believer in getting all of us to take one step out of our traditional roles and cultures and to kind of alter the lens through which we see climate change and fossil fuels, and try to understand a little bit more about the diverse issues that are involved in deciding how the oil and gas industry can help now to reduce climate emissions. So the one step in idea is to step one step away from where you are right now and see things a little bit differently. You may be asking why we're talking about oil and gas at all here. A lot of people here for the last 2 days have been expressing concerns about oil and gas operations and may have some concerns about us talking about fossil fuels as a continuing part of our energy mix. The fact is, oil and gas will be a long-term part of our energy mix. We're not going to be getting rid of the oil and gas industries anytime soon. But what we need to do now, people in the industry, environmentalists, engineers, advocates, all of us need to think through how we can approach the oil and gas industry and encourage it to operate in a way that is cleaner, has fewer greenhouse gas emissions, and in general is more protective of human health and the environment. Scientific American had an article the week before last, I think it was, that talked about possible health effects from being close to oil and gas operations. And they gave the astonishing statistic that about 2.4 million Americans live within a half mile of active oil and gas operations. I had never seen a statistic like that before. But all oil and gas operations are embedded within local communities and also in broader societies. And if they're to have a social license to operate, they need to really build the trust of those communities, to really find ways to communicate about the way they're operating, and to take a close look at their operations and try to make the kinds of changes that will be more protective of human health and more protective of the environment. So that's why we're here. And let me say that the oil and gas industry is enormously complex. It's huge. It involves exploration and production and transport and refining and consumption and a whole lot more. What we're going to be talking about today is limited to operations at onshore well pads. That's all we're going to be talking about. We're going to be focusing primarily on emissions from those well pads. You hear a lot of talk about methane, which is the potent greenhouse gas we most often talk about. There are a lot of other gas releases that are involved as well. But as I say, our concern is with improving operations to improve human health, to protect human health in the environment. And I'm not the person to tell you about how to do that. So I'm going to turn to Fred and ask you, you've been working so many years in the oil and gas industry. What can you do about the way the industry does operate, and what happens at the well pad, and what kinds of things can be done?
Very good. Thank you, Marilyn. Yeah, and thanks for allowing us to be here today. It's been very interesting listening to all the context that's been provided. It's great to see so many people and so much passion around environmental stewardship. And for me, that's the big change that I've seen over my 32 years when I entered the industry right out of college, just looking for my opportunity in the workforce, and I joined an oil and gas company. That was the opportunity. And the growth that I've seen over the years, we've talked about a lot of things today and yesterday, and we will the rest of the week, about the future and where we're going to take things. Some great technologies Klaus talked about, and some of the other folks. But what I want to share with you today are things that we can do today. So, and just to say that it's not all out in the future. To make this work and sustainability to work, we have to sustain ourselves today. And to be impactful today, we talked a lot about impact analyses, and that will come. And we've got the rest of the panel that's going to speak to you about that. But today, in our operations, we do a lot of things. I was invited to be part of the charrette that was at the University of Boulder. It's where I met Chip and first got to know about AREI-AREDAY. And I shared some things in my previous operation. I got to be operation manager of one of our largest operations in the United States. And we had a lot of wells. Quick question. Anybody know how many active oil and gas wells we have in the United States? Just throw out a number. Anybody? 600,000. Good guesses. Who said 1 million? Orphaned or active? Active. Over a million, yeah. It's rapidly approaching 1.75 million. So 1.6 million active oil and gas production wells. So what do we do with that? It's good. It's a fun fact, but what do we do with that? That's part of my I guess talk today is about what actions can we take now. We're going to be taking some further, but some of the things we use in my operation. In my operation in Wyoming was a great place to live and great place to work. I had 1,600 of these, and on almost every one of these, we ran them on solar power. It was a huge part of our business, and for a lot of reasons. One, it was by necessity, but other, it was our attempt to manage our emissions that we put forth. There's a lot of other things we can do today. Rod touched on it in the previous panel, and that's about the BACT, which is the best available control technologies we have today, and how do we implement those. There's even some more that we call reasonably available control technologies that are a little more practical. Sometimes the best possible solution is not practical yet, so we have to go with the practical ones. And so we've generated a list of those that we'll share with the industry as a whole, because I think Travis spoke on it in the previous panel, that there's huge corporations that have implemented some of this, and there's tiny companies who may or may not be aware of some of the things that are going on just because they don't have the visibility, the exposure, or the resources to do that. So that's some of the things we're doing. Other than solar, there's controllers that we control the wells with that emit either no gas or very little bits of gas. There's other things we can do to use air. We don't even have to use natural gas to operate our equipment. We can use air, compressed air. There's things Travis talked about, battery consolidation. We can generate our own power instead of relying on purchase power and use some of the product internally. So there's a number of things we can do, and that's part of the charrette, was not just about way out in the future, and you guys, may wonder, well, that's nice, but, that's way out there. What are you doing today? It's part of the reason that we wanted to include this part so you could see or hear about and understand some of the things that's happening today. And with that, I will turn it over to Marilyn, back to Marilyn.
Well, Travis, you've already told us a lot about some of the levers that can control industry responses to best practices, but tell us a little more about what Anadarko is doing, or just add on to what you have already had a chance to tell us.
Thank you. I mentioned that I work for Anadarko Petroleum. We're a large independent oil and gas company, which simply means that we don't have gas stations or refineries. The biggest companies usually do. Think about the names you see on the gas stations, so little insight to you who the majors are and who the independents are. But at Anadarko, there was a late question earlier that I kind of want to circle back to as far as this verification thing, because it plays right into my comments right now. The Environmental Protection Agency has had a voluntary program called the Natural Gas Star Program that's been in existence for over, I don't know how long it's been in existence, but Anadarko has participated in that program for 20 years. We've been an award-winning company for a number of those years, and this again is the EPA and their metrics and voluntary reporting and how do you measure and how do you reduce and those sorts of things. I also mentioned that Anadarko is a company that's got a certain amount of wheelbase financially that we can do certain things, not that we're just making money hand over fist at $42 oil. Thank you very much. But we are able to do what I consider to be massive R&D experiments that I'm going to get into right now very specifically. But I think that it's important to understand that there's an opportunity to expand that program. That program was created before the shale revolution occurred. So domestically, there was oil production, but it was predominantly gas production in domestic United States, and that has changed, and that's why we believe that expanding that program to include oil production as well, and incorporate some of the elements that the Energy Star program that applies to the building in will kind of complete the circle for us and give us a standard, if you will, that we can look to. Anadarko operates a little over 6,000 wells in Colorado. My two states are Colorado and Utah. I'm predominantly a property tax professional at the company, which means I'm really, really popular in Greeley, Colorado, one day a year on April 30th, because I generally deliver them between $125 and $150 million every year from one company. That's one producer in one county. We pay a lot of taxes, and about $40 million of that goes to K-12 education in Colorado. That doesn't make what we do good or bad. I'm simply telling you that we actually do carry our share of the load when it comes to taxes in our operations. But some of the things that we have specifically done, and we've experimented with this in Colorado, and it's been hugely successful, has to do with what we call a tankless battery design. When we did the charrette, the oil and gas charrette at CU Boulder, we had some preparation materials that included a video that showed a gentleman, it happened to be a gentleman, that was what we call thiefing a tank, which is simply a way when you have produced oil in a big 400-barrel tank on location, they send a great big truck out there, he pops the lid on the tank, and he does some tests to see some things and all that, and then he draws the oil away and takes it off to a refinery or wherever. And it was fascinating, and I loved it. It was great. And I mentioned to the group, you realize that at Anadarko, we don't do that anymore. And the reason we don't do that anymore is because opening those tanks, I mean, we've got vapor recovery and all this other stuff going on to capture these flash gases that I think Zane's going to talk about or explain to you a little more cleverly than I can. But if those tanks are such a big source of emissions, what happens if you just get rid of them? So at a consolidated location where we have, anywhere from 8 to 20 wells in one location, new technologies allow us to do that. We might have as many as 20 or more of these big 400-barrel production, we call them production tanks. They're steel tanks that take the liquids from the well. And you put the liquids in the well, and they sit in there for an hour, a day, a week, ever how long it takes for them to get pretty close to full for the guy to come out, or the lady to come out and draw the liquids off and take it to a refinery. If there's such a big source of emissions, what would happen if you just got rid of them altogether? First off, I just gained a lot of space back on my well location because those tanks are huge and they take up a lot of room. But the second thing is that we reduced all of the emissions associated with thieving those tanks and anything else that if there was some sort of a glitch in the technology, the vapor recovery units or whatever, we just eliminate that as a source. And instead, we take the production from the well, we run it through a 3-phase separator, which the 3 phases are gas, water, and oil. And immediately the liquids go through what's called a lease automated custody transfer meter, a LAC meter, and immediately into a pipeline, and it goes to a central facility that is located away from people's houses and where we have economies of scale, and we can do all the things we need to do to get the gases out of the oil and the oil out of the gases and all these things that have to happen to get this product into a saleable condition, if you will. We can't sell it to a pipeline if it's still all mixed together. So we can do that at a location where we've got economies of scale. And again, we are not only eliminating the potential emissions that include methane, but certainly all the other VOCs associated with oil and gas production. But not only do we eliminate that source of emissions, but we also eliminated those big trucks cranking through your neighborhood in the middle of the night to come get a load of oil when the tank's almost full, and the associated emissions with that truck, and the associated with emissions with the truck hooking up to the tank. And all of those things go away. And just to give you a couple of statistics, and this is one company, and there are other companies that are doing similar experiments, but this is one company in Colorado. So we started this program in about 2010, and if I could show you a graph, I would show you that our oil production in Colorado started at about 6 million barrels a year, and today is in the vicinity of 35 million barrels a year. Our VOCs, this measure of these emissions from these tanks, just the tanks, not the trucks, just the tanks. It started up here, and today it's right down here. We've had a 400% increase in the amount of oil that we produce in Colorado. And we have had I forget what the percentage is, like a 70%, there it is, 70% reduction in the amount of emissions. So that's not intuitive. We've got production going up, and you would think emissions would go up with it, and instead they're going down. So what we're saying is this technology works. But to the earlier conversation about the clean tax credits, this was about a $300 million investment, $350 million investment to one company. And we were in a position to do that. But Granny's oil and gas company that's got 3 wells can't make a $350 million investment, and it might not even make sense for them to hook into our system. So that's why we think those credits might be effective for some of those smaller operators. Just moving on, I mentioned the Central Oil Stabilization Facility, so let me bring in some of the other benefits that eliminating the tanks on location, going to the central facility do. We have 82% fewer tanks and the associated emissions with those. There are 350,000 semi-truckloads that did not happen because we implemented this system. And a truckload would be one of those big semis with a big tank on it, taking the oil from the location and taking it to either a central facility or a refinery or wherever it's going. 350,000, that's over about a 6-year period. We actually measured it at one time in trips around the equator of the Earth, and I lost count, but it was a big number. So 96% fewer trucks. There are emissions associated with those trucks just running them up and down the road. That's gone. There's wear and tear on the roads with these big, heavy trucks going up and down the road. That's gone. There's congestion that 350,000 truck trips would have been. That's gone. And the associated safety that goes along with that. So we feel like this is a really, really good story. And it's not a story, it's a fact. This is what we've done, and we can show you how we've been able to pull this off. Fred mentioned a number of other things that we do. If you've ever been at a stop sign and a big truck pulled up next to you and you heard this psh of noise, big trucks they have air brakes, And they have bleeders on the tanks because when you compress the air, it generates a little bit of condensation. And that water, in the winter, it'll freeze, and suddenly you've got a truck that doesn't have any brakes, or it'll restrict the air. So you have to get it out. Our operations are very similar to that. We get certain condensation within our lines, and we have to get it out of there. We figured out a way to use compressed air instead of the natural gas that comes right out of the well. If I puff compressed air into the air, I simply moved it from one location to the other. I didn't just vent a greenhouse gas. We use that not only in our production facilities, but in our midstream facilities, compressor stations, processing plants, any place where it makes sense, where we've got access to electricity. We're experimenting with electric drilling rigs. Now, to be clear, if you see a drilling rig, it's electric in most cases. What's not electric is the diesel engines that generate the electricity for the rig, because there's not a wire line that comes right in there from the power company. But we're experimenting with actually sourcing our electricity through the public utilities, through negotiations with them. How can we do this? How can we make this work? And it eliminates lots and lots and lots of fumes and emissions and burning diesel fuel or natural gas to generate the electricity that runs the rig. And those have some really impressive CO2 reductions. It's to the tune of 13 metric tons a day of CO2 that doesn't go into the atmosphere if we're able to incorporate this technology where it goes. You've mentioned most everything else, Fred, so I won't just repeat all of that, but I'm simply saying that at our company, we are very interested in our social license to operate. The oil and gas companies of today, for the most part, this is not your mom and dad's oil and gas company. I think that the light bulb is starting to come on in the boardrooms of a lot of these companies, and they're starting to realize that, just because that's how we did it last year, but that may not be a good enough reason to continue to do it that way this year. And it may not be a dollar for dollar recovery when we make investment in these sorts of things. If we get any of our investment back, we feel like we've done good, but it's paying for our social license to operate, just as an example. So Marilyn, let me stop there, because I worry I'll just keep going and people will fall asleep. So let's go there.
I think there's a lot of that, has been a lot of that in the room for a while, but it's late afternoon. I think we all are feeling the time at this point, but now you get to hear from Zane, who has been working for years to develop procedures and technologies that capture and stop emissions from wellheads. And Zane, I want you to tell us something about the technologies that are available, but also the technologies that are still needed, both to measure emissions, to answer, again, Sally's question about how do we evaluate emissions reductions and certify them, but also what technologies are still needed to actually reduce emissions or eliminate emissions from well pads.
I appreciate that, and Sally's exactly right. We have to measure things. All too often, people think they get environmental or green credit by doing something that makes them feel better. And the oil and gas industry, my brother and I, we were at ASU, and Bill Brandt was there, and he said, well, what is the cost of a barrel of oil? What is the carbon cost of this barrel of oil? And being an oil and gas professional, I looked him in the eye and said, I have no idea. And that is the sad truth. In 2017, we do not know the actual emissions from the oil and gas industry. The EPA has put in guidelines, they're rules of thumb. You count how many valves you have. This is the assumed leak rate of those valves. This is how many flanges you have. This is the assumed leak rate of those flanges, and it's all assumptions. So we really believe that the only way you can say that the oil and gas industry is getting cleaner is if you know how dirty it is today and then show us tomorrow what the difference is. So you have to have mass balance. Mass balance is simply, if you take a molecule out of the ground, you have to know that you've taken that molecule out of the ground. If it is not taken to the consumption point, then you have emitted it. It has been vented. And there's an interesting thing. When you talk about leaks versus vent, venting natural gas or oil is illegal. But a leak is something that you just can't prevent, right? It was an accident. And so, yeah, you shouldn't do it. You should minimize the leaks. But what happens if you design a facility knowing that it will accidentally leak? Is it a leak or now is it a vent? So when you look at the oil and gas industry, what we have to do is, at the production separator that Travis mentioned, we have a three-phase separator, which is really not three phases if you're a scientist. There's gas, there's water, and there's oil. We need to measure those three components. We need to know their composition. We need to know that on a real-time basis. That will give us the information we need to know to decide how well we've done at that site. Because what we do very well is how much did we sell? That is measured very well because that's where the money happens. What's interesting is when you start looking at this, there's a case study that happened in Texas where the royalty owner said, I want you to measure all of your emissions. Seems like a reasonable thing. I want to know how much you're not paying me because you haven't sold it. And interestingly enough, everybody was shocked about how much emissions were going up. It's like when we fill up our car with gasoline, if you're still one of the Neanderthals that uses liquid hydrocarbon fuel for your car, and you see a little bit of a shimmer coming out. How many people have went into the filling station and said, all right, you stole this from me because you have faulty filling equipment? So I go, well, it's so insignificant, we're not going to worry about it. Well, that's what happens on a grander scale in a lot of oil and gas production is well, yeah, there's something going up, but it's so insignificant, we're not going to look at it. Well, we have to stop making that assumption. We have to measure. We need to be scientists, not hopefully ignorant, I guess would be the nicest way to say it. And so when we take this information, then we can look at applying even existing technologies in an intelligent way when we actually identify this. One of the most perplexing things when my brother and I started looking into the environmental literature is everybody talked about methane. And that's very good if you're talking about natural gas transmission lines, but they look at it over the entire scope. Well, if you look on an oil production facility, everybody still talks about methane. Methane may be 10% of any emission. It might be up to 30% of the emission, but most of the emission is going to be propane all the way down to octanes. And those are economically very, very valuable compounds compared to methane. Methane has about 1,000 BTU per standard cubic foot. Propane is about 2,200. It's 2.2 times more energy dense, and it just goes up from there. And so how can we measure? When we measure, we see where we're bad. When you see where you're bad, you see where you can improve. And there are existing technologies, like I said, some of which has been implemented by Anadarko, that they're looking at it and say, when we bring all of this oil to one location, we have economies of scale to spend more money on getting that last little bit of efficiency. And that economy of scale has really helped them. What we are working to do is to develop technology, and we have some technology that was currently developed that will take the oil and gas production at pressure. See, one of the problems is that when you try to measure how much methane or ethane loss you have, we try to do it at atmospheric pressure. That is an extremely hard technological problem. If I show you and I say a flange is leaking, and tell me how many pounds per hour is coming out of that flange. Well, okay, we're going to have this sensor array around it, Zane. It's going to be great. Well, you have to know the wind speed. What's the mixing? What's the temperature of this? What's the temperature of that? What types of, what's the geometry of the leak? Is it mixing there? Is it not mixing? All of these things make it a horrible technological problem. So let's not leak. Let's not vent. Let's use the natural pressure that's there. We can deal with high pressure gases much more effectively. Vapor recovery units sound great. They sound great, and they help a little bit. But what you do is you go to your oil tank, and it's vaporing off all of these compounds. The compounds are mostly natural gas liquids. Natural gas liquids like to be a liquid at high pressure and are a gas at low pressure. So oil are hydrocarbons that are liquid at atmospheric pressure. So you go in there, it's bubbling off. You put it in your vapor recovery unit. You have oxygen entrainment issues, all sorts of problems. You compress it up and you compress it up. Then you cool it. You're going to put it in the pipeline. All the natural gas liquids drop out. And you put some methane and ethane in the thing, so into the pipeline, so you're helping. What do you do with those natural gas liquids? If you put them back in the oil tank, they're going to vaporize again. Then you're going to recompress them, and they're going to turn to liquid again, and it's going to come around. You can't do that. It's an endless loop. If you simulate it, it's really fun. Your vapor recovery unit horsepower keeps going more and more, and after you're about 50 million horsepower, your simulation says, hey, we can't make this converge. So do vapor recovery units help? Yes, but you have to take that. If you go onto a well site and you see a natural gas pipeline and you see atmospheric storage tanks and you don't see pressurized storage for natural gas liquids, you know that natural gas liquids are either being burned at the best case and are being vented at the worst case. So the technology needs to identify that. And like I said, there are things that we have developed that do address that, but we really don't know the state of the industry because we haven't measured. So Sally's right that we've heard this. Bill, Brant, and ASU, the conversations we had with them are really eye-opening because it's another set of eyes looking at this problem that we've grown up in, because what did my dad do? But he was in the oil and gas industry, and that's the way things usually work. And I can't, like Travis said, we can't do it the way our parents did it and say that's okay.
Thanks, Zane. We really wanted to leave some time for you to ask some questions, and we have about 10 minutes left. So I see a hand in the back of the room. Bob, can you start us off with a question, please?
Yeah, thanks, Marilyn. Excuse me, pardon my voice. I'm Bob Hallman, like Marilyn, a senior fellow at the Getches-Wilkinson Center, and also a regular fellow at the Columbia Energy Institute at Columbia University in New York. And I was involved to some degree in the charrette. So we've heard today, and we know it's based on our experience, that to date, the oil and gas industry has not undertaken, right, to significantly monitor, measure, and report on their emissions. Nor have they taken significant efforts, generally speaking, Anadarko's done a lot of really good things, obviously, and some have, to control those emissions or capture them. Two, we know that there are existing technologies and ones in the pipeline that are easily adaptable to address those things and perform those tasks. So why hasn't it happened? There are clearly major challenges to getting the oil and gas industry to take those very clear and simple and important steps. Travis, you identified a key one earlier this afternoon in terms of cost. I think at the charrette, and based upon my own experience, and I'm sure experience of others, there are several other challenges that need to be faced to move the needle, and as Hutch said, to get it to work. And I'd like you, if you would, to comment on those. I think the first one is political. Proposing tax cuts for the oil and gas industry, particularly in light of the subsidies they receive now, is normally not a popular thing to do and is going to be a very difficult sell. Two, the oil and gas industry, again, and based on my experience, and I think that of others, in part hasn't been measuring and controlling. One, because they haven't really been regulated to do that. And secondly, because there's a significant risk in their minds, and I think their lawyers' minds, that they might incur liability if they do that. For example, if you measure and start reporting on your emissions, people are going to ask, well, what are you doing to control them? And if you don't do something to control them, they might bring litigation to try to get you to control them under common law or some other potential avenue. Regulatory creep is a very big concern, I think, of the industry, a legitimate one. And third, I think there's the just notion of why rock the boat? We're doing very well now. We're making good money. What do I need to go and invest in new technology for? Why do I want to bring new equipment on and try to work and operate that and create, additional work? So in light of those circumstances, I'd really like you guys and all of you, in terms of your experience in the oil and gas industry, what incentives for what technologies do you believe now would be most attractive to the oil and gas industry to get them to invest in the next 6 to 12 months in some of these clearly existing technologies? And what do you think the best strategies are to try to implement those in terms of the circumstances that we know really exist as a practical matter?
Well, one of the things that I think Travis mentioned before is there's one bucket of money. And I think that's a big impediment to the implementation of technology. And another thing that Bob mentioned was another piece of equipment. Another piece of equipment has to be maintained, it has to be installed, and it's another headache, unfortunately, when, as Bob said, you're making money. So what we have to do is we have to, there has to be some carrots or some stick or maybe some combination of both that makes this measurement a necessity. And really the most, I guess, easy way to do that is if royalty owners, okay, yes, I will I will sign this lease, but you have to measure all of your emissions. And I think the royalty owners, the BLM, the state lands and federal lands, those are great places where, without a lot of trouble, that emissions measurement can happen, because it is a liability. Once you measure it, then that's a measurement of how bad you really are. Travis, would you like to expand on that?
I'd love to. Those are great questions too. And just as a sidebar, I'd like to talk to you afterwards about the subsidies, because I'm looking for those. And if you could help me get my hands on those in a clearer way, I'd really, really appreciate it. And I didn't mean that in a mean-spirited way. I hope you don't take it that way. But I think a couple of comments from me. There are approximately, and I can't prove this number, but I've been told that there are about 9,000 oil and gas producers in the United States. And so what that tells me is there's about 9,000 different ways of looking at this, different ideas about what's good enough, what's not good enough. So my first comment really has to do with just the awareness within the industry. If Fred learned from his dad and his dad learned from his dad, you know, in Fred's mind, we have made quantum leaps forward in progress, at least technologically speaking, the things we can do today as an industry, because after all, our companies are run by engineers. They're not run by CPAs like me. They're run by engineers, and these are really, really smart people. So I think that just awareness that, gosh, we really need to be looking at this. I think that that's something that light bulb is coming on a bulb at a time in the marquee, if you will, but there's 9,000 bulbs in the marquee, so it's not going to happen overnight, if that makes sense. And then I had a second comment, and I hope it comes back to me instantly, because right this minute I can't remember what it was, but it had something to do with the fact that, you know, I think it was Fred that made the comment about the best available practices, best available technology, and the technology that's simply reasonable, you know. Back to my farmer analogy from earlier on, the farmers always leave a little bit of grain in the field. And it's not that there's anything wrong with the grain, it's just that's just how their technology works. Now, if there was some way to point out to all of the farmers that, you know, there's a consequence associated with leaving that grain in the field that you're really not thinking of, because again, you learned it from your dad and he learned it from his dad. That's part of why I'm here, is because I went to the oil and gas charrette thinking I was going to be crucified, and instead I learned from these people, and I think they learned from me. But we're having this dialogue now, instead of me having a really poor opinion of extreme environmentalists, and by the way, I don't know anybody at my company that's not an environmentalist, and the opposite of that. I think instead we're looking at ways, how do we have this dialogue? Are there things that you're sensitive to that simply because we've never had that conversation, maybe now's when we start having that conversation, and maybe that now is when these ideas start rising to the top. You've seen the actions through the board meetings, the annual board meetings through companies where there's activism that's increasing in those, and I think that message is starting to resonate. And it may not take the form of response that you immediately want. They may not fall to their knees and cry their eyes out, but they might change the way they do business. And I think that's what's really important in this conversation, is how do we move this conversation forward, and how do we actually achieve some of these goals?
Brett, do you want to?
Sorry about that. We'll get a mic over there. Great conversation, like you've been saying, and there's discussion about the hauling issue and the truck issue. We in Ohio take a lot of frack water or frack waste from out of state and have injection wells, and that's a big concern about local water quality, et cetera. I know the subject matter here was methane and the gas emissions, but can you talk a little bit about improvements in the water treatment?
Let me just jump in and say that there's going to be another charrette that addresses the specific issue that's going to be dealing with water in the oil and gas industry. So if you don't mind, let's defer that to our day next year when we can have a chance to talk about that.
Yeah, what we could do is afterwards or tonight, we can talk a little bit about that. There is an answer, so just so we can at least get you some information. Yeah. But we'll do a full charrette around it, as Marilyn said. But we can get you something today for sure, because it's a big issue right now.
Absolutely,
it is a big issue.
Patrick.
Because maybe there's conflict of interest with the board of directors to actually, do the kind of research in the industry. What do you think about that?
I'll just say that Wiley, who organized this charrette along with Rod Richardson, who you heard from before, we were just at breakfast yesterday talking about kind of the future of where we're going to go this and leadership in this, and that exact topic was discussed. It was something that I was actually thinking about. I was in the industry for 32 years, still loosely connected to it, and we did what we did. But what we actually need is that, you know, you can be led from within or led from without. So if you have someone, a university, a foundation that says, you know what, let's get a few people, let's lead this and not only lead it, but excel in it in a way that we can change the way the industry operates with new ideas, new technologies. One of the things that I tell everybody that we hired into my operation, every new person, every young face, I said to them, whatever you do, change us. Don't let us change you and make you part of the machine. The machine is it. We need you to hold those values that you have. We talked about the millennials and the nexus and that energy and passion around that. Charities, whoever we bring. So if you get an opportunity to do it as a charity, or if you get an opportunity to engage with an oil and gas company, brilliant ideas here. We know what we know, so bring those to us.
Can I just ask one question?
Sure.
Is it on? So I'm interested because I realize the liability for the shareholders and the production at the time. If you uncover a potential negative problem for the industry by reporting venting, maybe there's, you know, the entire oil and gas industry is not interested in doing any kind of work with a, you know, pilot project. But maybe if the oil and gas industry understood that in order to get over this hurdle, to monitor the hydrocarbon releases and to use carbon credit software to give carbon credits to pay for technology that would actually make the industry more efficient and cost effective, and then be able to clean up fracking water. There's another technology we're working with too. Sure. Maybe, you know, we could design some sort of a forum with the oil and gas industry with a private charity to do these pilot tests, and maybe we could do some disclosure agreement where the oil and gas industry would work with the charity for the results that are good and benefit the oil and gas industry, and not come out with, you know, information that would discredit or you know, devalue the oil and gas industry, because maybe that's what the big concern is, to get to that next level.
Well, and I think what you're talking about is something that's very important. From the research that I've done, there's an economic reason to do this. Efficiency is always better, but when you have something that is implemented, like what you're talking about, Patrick, it's very important to show it and to look at everything, you know, really from a clean slate. All too often, everybody just adds another gadget, and adding another gadget doesn't always lead to the most efficient solution, and I would say very, very rarely leads to the most efficient solution, and that's what the oil and gas industry has been doing. So I think that, you know, we're doing some work with RMI, the Rocky Mountain Institute, and really looking at how are we going to have a positive impact, but I think that there's a lot of room for other people to help in that, and glad that you brought that up. And we're out of time.
We are out of time. Is that what you're going to tell us, Chip?
Maybe I can just take one.
Okay.
Yeah.
So we'll give
Sure,
Chip.
yeah, absolutely.
I really appreciate, I want to say how much we appreciate you guys coming to AREI's AREDAY. I think that first you might have had a little bit of trepidation about that, but I think you also see that we're a reasonable summit that wants to address these issues head on in a way that's about, you know, it's not about us versus them, it's about we all together, and that really is the way that we look at things. And so, and every single one of us that uses fossil fuels has to own up to the fact that we are the consumers that are buying the products and driving the vehicles and heating and cooling our homes, et cetera. But my question is to Zane on the issue of mass balance, and that we are now, that the industry itself is beginning to look at all of the various molecules, whether it's methane, pentane, octane, ethane, you know, all of the propane, that these are actually valuable commodities, that if we were to catch them, that they could be not only kept from going into the atmosphere, further exacerbating the situation, but also creating some real value within the system that would end up being a win-win-win, where we're cleaning up the petrochemical industry. So maybe we could, if you wouldn't mind, just maybe everybody could just comment a minute on that issue.
Well, and it's a very interesting thing. When we first started looking at this problem, it was from the standpoint as we've got to clean up the environment. But a molecule of methane, or let's say 1,000 standard cubic feet, it's 1 million BTU, is worth about $3. If you take one propane molecule, well, let's say you take 35 cubic feet of propane. So you go 1,000 cubic feet of methane, 35 cubic feet of propane, that makes 1 gallon of propane liquid, and it retails for about $1.50. So you have this huge jump in value than leaving the propane in the natural gas. If you can take that propane, or let's say octane, and put it in the oil, it's worth that much more. It basically doubles. So methane has a very low energy content. Propane is about 2 times that, and then they just get more and more energy dense. So what the technology we looked at is, okay, take this emission source, this lost, this inefficiency, however you want to label it, and put it through a system that we maximize the oil produced. That's where it's highest economic value. Then we create a natural gas liquid stream, which has a very high value compared to natural gas. What we can't put in those 2 streams stays in natural gas, but at a pressure, so it's in a pipeline. What we've done is, by maximizing the revenue, we now have money to actually implement this without, a change in law, without a change in regulatory framework. We actually have that, and so that's the reason flash gas control exists. Is that's what we're doing and it has an economic driver. But I think what Bob Hallman said is very true. Every time you add equipment, you add complexity. When you add complexity, that's operational. So the oil and gas companies that we've talked to, and over the last few weeks that we've launched this company, interestingly enough, have talked about emissions before they've talked about the profit, which has never happened in any industry or any industry type setting I've ever had. They understand that if the public hates them, like a lot of them are starting to, and not without reason, that they're not going to be able to operate, and that is a big problem. So they're talking to us from the standpoint of, oh, you make us money or it breaks even. One company actually said, if it can almost break even, we want your equipment. And we're doing evaluations of their facilities. And that's a very unique change. And that's because there are people saying things. They're saying what's on their mind. They're getting involved in the process. So I know we're way out of time, but it's amazing the changes that have happened in and how the industry operates and how the industry thinks about things. And that's because of people like the people that have attended here at AREI-AREDAY.
So let's stop on that positive note and ask all of you to take that one step in and take another look at the oil and gas industry and think about the things you've heard here about what's actually happening with industry practices. And with that, I guess the next step is to the nest, or
No,
are you?
we need some
you're gonna-
closing remarks from
Okay,
Chair.
all right.
All right.
But thank you very much.